Recording? Yeah, okay. Right, this week we're going to be looking at what's called subcultural theory. Now, I thought it would be quite interesting to start off with by looking at a very short video clip. But before we go on to look at the video clip, I just want to give you some background information before we start, just to kind of set the scene. So firstly, so we're looking at subcultural theory. Now, what really we're looking at is what's sometimes called cultural diversity theory. Okay. Now, subcultural theory flows from strain theory, the theory we looked at 2 weeks ago. And in terms of the context in which subcultural theory begins to develop is the 1950s and the 1960s. And this is really key. Each week I keep banging on about how it's really important to situate these theories in their context. Well, I think it's been in this week, particularly, we really see why theory is grounded in context. Because the 1950s and the 1960s were very peculiar times. They were very distinct times in a whole range for a whole range of different reasons. So rather than me explaining the context to you, I thought it'd be interesting for us to quickly look at the video. Now this is on YouTube. Okay. Now when you obviously I'm recording this lecture. I think that this piece of video might get blocked by YouTube when I upload it. So I'll tell you what the reference is, how to find this clip, okay, in case it gets blocked. You need to do a Google search for Fred Perry. Go on YouTube. Sorry, go on YouTube and you search for Fred Perry Subcultures. Okay, and this one is called Teddy Boys.
British youth subculture starts in that rather grey period after the war. No longer have you got conscription, so you haven't got a regiment to go and join. No longer have you got a uniform to put on that the government tell you to wear. So you're going to invent your own one. We won't try to put us down, just because we get around.
The circumstances that really led to teenage as a phenomenon and as a sector of the population that could be marketed to were principally economic and social.
Suddenly you've got a couple of bob in your pocket, you've got these new sounds coming over from America, so suddenly there's a music to go with it, this rock and roll. Hey presto, a subculture.
Rock and roll was coming in from the early 50s. There was a move that was happening in America via movies and American culture, pop culture, which was eagerly consumed in Britain by these teenagers with money in their pockets to spend on these marketable goods. And so that's really how teenage as a phenomenon started.
Instructions are to prepare for an attack by an unknown enemy. That's what he meant.
There's something behind this, something we don't understand.
My mother and all the women who used to hang out said, who are these young men who aren't men and they aren't boys? What are they? And someone said, well, they're the new teenagers.
Movies such as The Wild One, where the look is so fabulous and really expresses the rebellion that everyone felt. And the lines like, you know, what are you rebelling against, Johnny? What do you got?
And they're looking at the movies and they're listening to the records, but they're making their own version of it. So it has influences from everywhere, certainly from America, but it never looks American. It always looks uniquely and distinctly British.
The Teddy Boys were the first, they were the pioneers, they were the first big youth culture that came along. They had a uniform that had an identifiable look that kids could tap into that was divorced from what their parents were doing.
Juvenile delinquents, happy as can be.
The Ted movement is absolutely pivotal at a time where a man could be a peacock. They were making it okay for a man to really care about, you know, how his hair would be done, you know, the DA, the duck's arse.
It's such a bold look, such a strong look, and as with any youth culture, it's about rejecting the other things around you.
The classic look of a teddy boy would include the drape jacket. Initially, they didn't wear what we now know as brothel creepers. They wore heavy-soled shoes.
A waistcoat made out of a different fabric, you know, which was normally a sort of brocade or something like that.
Every opportunity to accessorise and make more flamboyant was taken.
It was an Edwardian style that was favoured originally by supposedly guards officers, you know, the ultimate English aristocratic creme de la creme, who went for this rather kind of old-fashioned style to mark themselves out when they weren't in uniform.
The combination of that look, which was sharp as anything, moved down class very, very rapidly and got almost parodied. So you got the Bill Haley Edwardian look.
So it goes from being this rather kind of classic Edwardian style to being something really leery with pink linings and pink socks and then great big pompadoured hair and all of this sort of stuff.
Here they are, these working class guys with money in their pocket who decided to kind of jib at the upper classes by adopting their uniform and subverting it.
It's an interesting thing that youth culture kind of fuck up the class system to quite a substantial degree.
What could you work with if you hadn't got money or education? You could work with what the music you consumed and what you had on your back. You couldn't change your house, but you could do a lot with good threads.
So all that creativity of the working class kids down on the streets gets pushed to the margins. So what do they get good at? They get good at trousers.
There was always this contrast between middle-class youth cultures, which were about casualness, extreme casualness, abandonment, and working-class youth cultures, which were about a tight, very carefully rehearsed look.
You gotta rap rock, hey, you gotta rap rock, yeah, you gotta rap rock, hey, you gotta rap rock.
The political standpoint, it wasn't that coherent, but the TEDs was pretty backward-looking. You know, they were, for the most part, inherently conservative, not politicised in any formal way. And if you look at, for instance, if you look at something like Absolute Beginners, it very definitely paints the TEDs, maybe unfairly, as the racists.
I hated that sort of 50s teddy boy, because I already knew what teddy boy stood for, you know, because my dad and particularly my uncles used to fight them in the 50s.
Once it started getting all this bicycle chain publicity and the Notting Hill riots and stuff like that, then through the press, that attitude then spreads to the suburbs and further afield.
If we look at British subculture and the rise and reign of the teddy boys, at the same time are rockers. They're wearing leather jackets, they're interested in motorbikes, they don't want to be sitting around in, you know, fine clothes which cost a lot to have made up. They want to wear utilitarian gear in emulation of people like Marlon Brando and the Wild One.
They came out of a more muscular kind of American culture, which was based on bikes and fighting.
Yes, they took on elements of American film culture, but again, they Englishised it, and how better than with the British motorcycle? You know, the rocker embraced possibly our finest technical achievement, the motorcycle.
What could be better than throwing on your jacket, getting on your BSO, terrorising down the A13, and going to Southend and having, you know, bub and squeak.
Rockers parents are the first to really show that there was a generation gap, because no parent wanted their son to lounge around in, you know, oil-covered jeans, great big boots, a string vest, and a filthy leather jacket. By mid-50s, we had a mass communication system. Television was coming in, obviously radio was very big.
Media is fundamental to the making of large-scale or at least national subcultures, where people pick up a set of ideas and a set of clothing from people they've never met.
This part of the city when the sun refused to shine.
The media do play a kind of a mixed role in this story. They're always hungry for the latest teen sensation, if you like, especially if they can ally it with a bit of violence.
The fear aspect of youth culture is very, very useful to any administration to have something that people don't understand, that you can say, we're not sure about this, this might be a bad thing.
Watch my daddy in bed, watch his hand turn.
So you've got the Teddy Boys and the Notting Hill Riots, you've got the mods and rockers fighting each other down on the sea at Brighton, you've got skinheads on the football terraces, and the story goes on, you know, punks smashing things up, all of these. Each one of these youth cultures has a kind of a sensational element to it that the media leap on. But what that really does, of course, is it just makes it incredibly popular.
We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do.
But then what it also does is in the end it kind of kills it. Because the essence of almost all of these subcultures is that they are elitist. They're started by a few kids who want to do it differently.
Now my girl, you're so young and pretty.
The British were particularly good at exploiting this area of visual expression because we're an island, we're a small little community, and ideas get translated usually from the big city, usually from London, around the country quite quickly.
What happens is a bunch of kids who can't play music, they haven't got guitars, they haven't got drums, they might not even have record players back in the 50s, but they've got trousers. All they've got is what they stand up in. So the way that they can make themselves special and different is by what they're wearing. And that starts it off.
We add something to it, whether it's imported from Jamaican culture or America, and we English it up and it gives it that edge.
We gotta get out of this place.
Okay, if you have a look on YouTube, you'll see that, let me just reduce this, you'll see that there's various other clips here. Let me go back on. So there's subculture mods, subculture 80s, 90s, soul boys. Have a look at some of these. If we get time, we'll look at these in the seminar, when we have a seminar on this. Okay, right. Now, the purpose of showing you that was that I wanted you to see the context in which subcultural theory developed. And really, I think the thing you need to take from this is that in the 1950s, what was happening was this was post-World War Britain. So, as a consequence of this, people wanted a better world. People come back from the Second World War and they wanted a better world in which to live. But what happened is the children, the children that were around in the 1950s and 60s, their experience of life was very different to their parents. And what happened was that there was the generation gap was both extended and extenuated. Okay, so you begin to get the emergence of a new group of people, as I said on the video, a group of teenagers. So they were neither adults nor were they children. They were a new group. And increasingly, this group begins to get associated with delinquent titles. This is something that really harks back to the Victorian days in many ways. The relationship between youth and criminality. Right, well, let's look at what we mean by culture then, okay? Because we're talking about subcultures and the emergence of subcultures. Well, first, we need to understand what a culture is. Now, I've got a quote here from Clark, and this is what Clark says. Clark says that culture is the way in which social relations of a group are structured and shaped, but it is also the way these shapes are experienced, understood, and interpreted. Okay? Now, what Clark is basically saying here is that a culture provides us with maps of meaning. Maps of meaning. Okay? So it's through culture that we can understand the world around us. It provides us with these structures. Okay, now, obviously subcultures then, like maps of meaning, it says, maps of meaning, yeah? Obviously subcultures then are something that are seen as different to wider society in some way. Now the classic study on subcultures was carried out by this guy, Albert Cohen, in a book called Delinquent Boys. It was published in 1955. Now, in many ways, Cohen's work is similar to Merton on a range of different levels. But there are some differences. But firstly, what Cohen does is, in the same way that Merton does, is that he links delinquency to the nature of American society itself. Okay, so he draws linkages between delinquency and the nature structure of American society itself. Now, in terms of differences, Cohen's work is slightly different to Merton's work in a whole range of different reasons. Firstly, this is something we looked at in the seminars last week. Some of you were saying that Merton looks at individual reactions and doesn't explain group reactions to criminality. Well, what Cohen does is his explanation seeks to provide an explanation for group delinquency. So he looks at group reactions in the shape of a subculture. Okay, so that's something that's different. Also, you'll remember that Merton looks at instrumental forms of crime. Okay, so or instrumental motivations, for example. So this is where people commit crime in order to actually acquire something, so acquiring material rewards. Now what Cohen does is, Cohen provides us with an explanation that seeks to provide an explanation for non-instrumental crimes as well. So he looks at, his explanation provides us with an understanding of why people might engage in non-instrumental things like fighting or criminal damage or violence, this sort of thing. Okay. Right, so let's look at what Cohen did there. So this is the classic piece of work on subcultures. This is where subcultural theory was born, if you like. Now, what Cohen does is he says that typically delinquent behaviour is condensed in the lower working classes. Okay, he says it's something that's condensed in the lower working classes, particularly lower working class boys. Okay, and he describes these as corner boys. Okay, he calls them corner boys. Because these boys hung around corners, we saw in the video there, didn't we? Lots of boys just basically hanging around. Now this is a term that's used by somebody called White in his book Street Corner Society. Okay, so he's describing corner boys, and these boys are just hanging around, if you like. So, criminality, deviancy is condensed in the lower working classes. Now, Cohen's main focus is on this, status. He's looking at how status is ascribed in society. So that's the starting point. And he says that lower working class boys experience what he calls status frustration. Status frustration. Sometimes this is referred to as the problem of adjustment. Okay, status frustration or the problem of adjustment. Right, and this is what Cohen says. He says that in American society is dominated by middle class values. Okay, he's talking in the 1950s. So in mainstream society is dominated by middle class values, middle class standards of what's right and what's wrong. So that you engage in the education process, that you're polite and carry yourself in a certain way, that you talk in a certain way as well. Okay? So it says that in American society in the 1950s, there were these dominant middle class values. Now, Cohen says that these lower working class boys lack the resources to compete on equal terms in the status stakes. So they lack the resources to gain this status. So, what they do is they look for their own solutions. In essence, this is really important for us to emphasise, for subcultural theorists, subcultural theory provides individuals and groups with solutions. So for these guys, criminality, deviancy is a subcultural solution for them. It's a subcultural solution to status frustration because they lack the resources to compete with middle class boys. Now, Cohen says there are 3 different types of solutions that are available to these lower working class boys. Okay? So the first solution to this status frustration is the stable corner boy. The stable corner boy. Now, these basically, the stable corner boy will basically, according to Cohen, engage in minor delinquent acts. Okay, so they do not stray that too far. So they basically make the best of a bad job, but they do engage in small minor acts of deviancy and criminality. But essentially, they're hedging their bets. The second solution, according to Cohen, is what he calls college boys. Now, the college boys have aspirations to gain this middle class status. So they seek their status through education and working hard in college. They're obviously college boys. The third solution, and this is the area that we're looking at, he calls the delinquent boy. The delinquent boy. Okay, so this is the focus of us. Now, he says that this is obviously the focus of Cohen's study. These groups then are looking for solutions to the lack of middle class status. So they do this by forming delinquent subcultures. And it's based on a Freudian concept called reaction formation. Reaction formation basically means that where an individual fails to achieve something, so middle class values, middle class status, what the individual does is the individual ends up rejecting that which was previously the object of desire. Okay, so you reject that which was previously the object of desire. So if you're blocked, if your opportunities of achieving this middle class status is blocked because you lack the resources, you then turn against it. Okay? So you reject that which was previously the object of desire. Now, according to Cohen, these young lads then are not rejecting status per se, but they're rejecting a particular type of status. So what happens then is that these subcultures become a contra-culture. A contra-culture. The subculture itself becomes the source of status. Okay? So if you're unable to, because of a lack of resources, gain status through conventional means, then you create subcultures which invert, turn around these middle class values, so you gain status through the culture itself. Okay, so status is ascribed to the group, to the individual through the subculture because of these problems of adjustment. So the subculture itself becomes the source of status. And often these contracultures then become inversions of middle class values. Okay, is this making some sense? Okay, so Cohen's work laid the foundations for subcultural theory then, and he's looking at subcultures as being situated within the structure of American society itself. So within American society there are these very clear middle class values, but these lower working class boys lack the resources to attain status through this conventional mechanism, so they create these subcultures. So the mods and rockers, the teddy boys, this sort of thing. Okay, so you invert these mainstream values. Okay, so whereas in middle class values, there's a particular way of carrying yourself which is polite, you invert it, so you become impolite. So middle class values of being civil and non-violent, you invert it. Okay, middle class values of being neat and tidy, you invert it. Okay, so that which previously becomes was the objective desire becomes inverted. Now, Cohen's work was later developed by these guys, Cloward and Oley. They all wrote a very famous book 5 years after Delinquent Boys in 1960 called Delinquency and Opportunity. Okay, Delinquency and Opportunity, a theory of delinquent boys. That was first published in the 1960s. Now again, it's important for us to pause and consider the context, what was happening in the 1960s. Again, we had the emergence of mods and rockers as a very distinctive subcultural group, particularly in this country. Now, in the same way that Merton focuses on blocked means, this is something that Cloud and Oley also pick up on as well. They say that often, if there's too much emphasis on ends without providing the means of achieving those ends, this can lead to inequality of opportunity. Inequality of opportunity, or the absence of equality of opportunity. But for Cloward and Oley, they say that strain is most likely to be felt by Cohen's college boys. Do you remember, these were the guys that were hedging their bets, the ones that kind of aspired to middle class values, but were still engaged in kind of minor acts of criminality. Why was deviancy most likely to be located within the college boys? Well, according to Cloward and Oley, these lower working class boys then were still trying to better themselves. They were still aspiring to these middle class values, and this would lead to anger and resentment. Okay, because they're aspiring to these middle class values, but their opportunity to achieve these middle class values is blocked. They do not have the sources, the resources, so therefore that blocks one's opportunity. They don't have the right contacts, they don't have the social background, they don't have the right accents, so on and so forth. So what Cloward and Oley do is they develop their own typologies. They develop 3 ideal types. Do you understand what an ideal type is? Anybody know what an ideal type is? An ideal type is basically a model. Okay, they are models. They are ways of seeing. Okay? Or to put it another way, they are a rhetorical device. A rhetorical device. Rhetorical device. Oh, device. Why is it device? By the way. Okay, now what I mean by this then is that these ideal types that Cloud and Owen develop are ways of seeing, they're ways of talking about crime and criminality. Okay? And the three rhetorical devices, or the ideal types that they develop, are called, firstly, criminal subculture. Note them down and I'll tell you what they are. So firstly, criminal subculture is the first one. Okay, we'll go through each of these in turn eventually. The next one is the violent subculture. So criminal subculture, violent subculture, and thirdly, the retreatist subculture. Okay? So, when these lower working class boys experience straightening because they don't have the necessary means of achieving the desired ends, this leads to anger and resentment, which can then turn to three ways of adapting them, three ways of coping, if you like, three ways of obtaining opportunity. So criminal subcultures. Right, the criminal subcultures then were associated by Cloud and Owen with lower class neighbourhoods. Okay, so they said that where this happened, where strain was to arise, some criminal subcultures would emerge, and these were associated with criminal with lower class neighbourhoods. But in these lower class neighbourhoods, there would be older, maturer individuals who would keep a lid on things. They wouldn't allow the criminality to get too much, to get out of control. They would keep them in check. So the conflict, the subcultures would be regulated by these older delinquents. And they say that these criminal subcultures would largely be engaged in things like property crime, low-level property crime. The violent subculture, in contrast, was, according to Cloud Owen, associated with highly disorganised neighbourhoods. In many ways, the highly disorganised neighbourhoods that Shaw and McKay were talking about last week, they said that the neighbourhoods were socially disorganised, didn't they? The third adaptation, the third ideal type, is the retreatist subculture. The retreatist subculture, according to Cloud and Owen, were associated with drug use, with illicit drug use. Right, now, it's kind of a whistle-stop tour, this really, of subcultural theory, but this is the foundations, okay? This was where subcultural theory starts then. Now, subcultural theory, as some of you are probably realising, is particularly useful in understanding the formation of gangs. But a lot of this stuff, particularly the stuff we've just looked at, is focusing on the American experience. So you might be thinking, well, can we apply that to the English experience? Now that's what we're going to do now. We're going to be looking at how these concepts were later developed by the what's called the Birmingham School. Okay? It's the BCCCS, the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. The Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. Now this was situated in the 1970s in this country. Okay? And they're looking at culture and subculture. But more importantly, what they do is they try to situate subcultures within a Marxist framework. Okay, so they add on kind of a Marxist element to this. Do you want me to say it again? The Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. You've got the video anyway, you can get on the video. The Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. They're looking at subcultures and they're looking at subcultures within a Marxist framework. And you're all experts on Marxism because you've just done an essay on it, haven't you, for a different module. But we're going to be looking at Marxist explanations later on in the module, that's for sure. So don't worry too much if you've not got a background in Marxism, we will look at it. But basically, what they're trying to do is, what the Birmingham School was trying to do, was they were trying to place subcultures within the context of class inequality. That's really essentially what they were trying to do. So they were trying to place subcultures in the context of class inequality and conflict. Now, the Birmingham School, in essence, tried to basically say, this is the general thrust of what they were trying to say, was that subcultures were, in their view, an attempt by the groups themselves, by these delinquent subcultures, to recapture a rapidly disappearing sense of community. That's what they were arguing. They were saying that these delinquents then were trying to recapture this sense, this disappearing sense of community. And what they did is then, they focused on this subcultural style. And they said that we as academics, we as criminologists then, what we need to do is we need to develop methods and means to decode subcultural style. Methods and means of decoding subcultural style. We need to read the signs. We need to decode the symbolic meaning of subcultural style. Now, for the Birmingham School then, these subcultures were engaged in a very subtle form of resistance. That's a term that you would be familiar with if you've looked at Marxist work before. So it's a form of resistance, a resistance to dominant values regarding how young people should behave. Okay, resistance to the dominant values on these middle class values and how young people should behave. Now, going back to the video, you would have seen in the video that the whole teddy boy look was all about kind of inverting this kind of. Do you remember they said that some of the in the Edwardian period, some of these officers would have a particular way of dressing to set themselves apart from everyone else. So what the teddy boys did is they acquired that image, inverted it, they took it, they turned it around. Maybe a contemporary example that we could use would be the chavs wearing baseball caps, Burberry baseball caps or Burberry stuff. It's a similar kind of way. It's kind of taking, it's kind of like, it's almost like sticking, young people sticking their finger up to the middle classes, saying, well, look, you know, we can afford this stuff too. So, you know, it's a way of kind of acquiring this thing and inverting it. So it's a form of resistance, according to the Birmingham School. So, what they say is, they say the meaning of things isn't fixed. Okay, so they highlighted that cultural meanings are not fixed. And they say that in post-war Britain, or post-war subcultures in particular, these subcultural meanings were transformed. So whereas violent acts would ordinarily be something that should be avoided, in subcultures they become something of value. People can gain status through these acts. So they say that we need to decode the style. Now, let's look at a contemporary example, the hoodie. What does the hoodie mean to you? What does it mean on a cultural level? What comes to mind?
Youth.
Youth. Good, brilliant. Youth. Or youth, sometimes spelled. Youth. What else? Boys. Okay, yeah, boys. Youth, boys. One other big thing that nobody's mentioned. Subcultures. Well, it is a subculture. Hoodies is a subculture.
Hoodies is a subculture. It's a subculture.
Yes. What do we associate with it? Youth, boys. One other big thing. Gangs, criminality there. Yeah, right. Now, according to the Birmingham School, what we need to do is we need to decode these groups. How do these groups get this kind of this status attached to them? Why is it that we associate hoodies with euphoria and crime there? We need to decode that. We need to understand the mechanics of this process. Okay. Very basically, I can see from some of your faces you're looking a bit kind of what's going on here. Let me get this. It's pretty straightforward. This really. What they're saying is that in all societies there's a culture. Okay, these cultures provide maps of meanings, ways that we see and ways which we understand the world. Now, these delinquent groups and these gangs, these subcultures, are just basically creating a different map of meaning, a different way of seeing the world. So, according to Cohen then, people in America were aspiring to these middle-class values. Now, because they lacked the resources of achieving these middle-class values, they inverted the values. Okay, so being smart, being polite, you invert them, you turn them around, so you become untidy, you become rude. Okay, so what used to be the object of desire becomes inverted. So these, all of this, which we're looking at today then, is an attempt to explain how subcultures are often a solution to various structural problems. That's essentially what they're saying, that subcultures are a solution. So, the question here then is, in what way is subcultures, or in what way is crime or delinquency a subcultural conclusion, a solution? So this is what these guys are saying. They're developing from strain theory. They're looking at how individuals or groups in particular, how groups or how there can be a group adaptation to blocked opportunities or blocked status. Yeah. So can you see how this is a development of strain theory? Not. Yeah. Okay. Right. That's pretty much where we've got to in this module so far. Then this, in case you're interested, is what we call a meso explanation. Okay. All the other stuff that we've looked at so far has been forms of sociological positivism, apart from passivism, obviously. But this, what we're looking at today, then provides us with another turning point in the module. This seeks to understand how criminality can be a group response. So we're looking at, obviously, gangs and this sort of thing. Okay. Now, when we come back next semester, we're going to be looking at what's called radical forms of criminology. Okay. Really, what we've done so far, most of this you should be pretty familiar with if you've got a background in sociology. Next semester, when we come back, we're going to be looking at this subject in a whole new kind of radical way, a much more critical way as well. But these are pretty much the foundations for this subject. These are the foundations for criminological theory.
Do we not have lectures or seminars next week?
Sorry?
Do we not have a lecture or seminar next week?
No, as I said at the beginning, we're having the tutorial. Yeah. So there's no. Sorry, just to clarify, there's no lecture next week. Okay, we're going to be having the tutorials. Okay, those of you that are looking at the news, it's because you're late and you missed the important announcement that I made because you were late. Okay, so next week then I'll be putting up on my door, my office door. Hold on a minute. In RS511, I'll be putting up my door. Just a minute. A sheet of A4. So you need to book an appointment, or you don't have to. If you want to come and see me about your essay, your assignment, or any questions you've got about the module, it doesn't have to be about your essay, then you need to book an appointment, so you need to put your name on the board, okay, for a 15-minute slot. It'll be between 9 and 12 next Monday, okay? If you don't put your name on there, then the chances are you won't be able to see me. So you need to book in advance. Okay? I won't be seeing anyone unless you've booked in advance. So that'll be going on in the next couple of days.
We can have one seminar.
Could you?
We can have one seminar.
Because I understand there are